In ancient times, Pythagoras lectured from behind a curtain, believing that what he said was more important than seeing him speak. Sound has been important in many forms of communication for at least as long as human records have existed. My project goal was relatively simple. I wanted to explore sound in Dungeons & Dragons and how it contributes to the sense of immersion experienced by players. In order to continue, it is necessary to explain Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D. D&D is a game that involves a dungeon master and players. The players assume the role of a character and act according to that personality and the physical limitations of the game. The dungeon master, or DM, is representative of the world the players inhabit, along with anything and everything in it. Essentially, it is like playing a computer game, but instead of a program with code and limited controls, the players tell the DM what they would like to do, and the DM responds with a description of what happens. D&D is essentially a collective storytelling experience. The DM creates situations for the characters to improvise in. However, there are no essential visual components to the game. Because of this, sound plays a rather special role in tying together the collective imagination and creating a sense of immersion. I relied mainly on research from a ludomusicological perspective, as it explores aspects of music and play which are also important in D&D. I supplemented this information with research in film music, sound, and radio. As I found no research on D&D and sound, I used my own ethnographic survey of how sound impacts players around the world. I hope that this new research proves interesting enough to inspire new avenues of inquiry. I used both qualitative and quantitative questions to assess this via an anonymized online survey distributed over the internet. I have designed an approach comparing film, video games, TV, and radio drama, as I have observed that all of these have related functions of sound and music. This table demonstrates some of the expected functions of music in different media. We can see from this that many of these functions are shared, such as smooth transitions, thematic consistency, and relationship to the current action. D&D music follows similar patterns. How close the action relates to the soundtrack of a D&D session depends entirely on how dedicated and prepared your DM is. There is some evidence that the more dynamic and reactive the score is to a player's actions, the more immersive it is, but more studies are needed to create a more nuanced idea of this. For example, does this immersion differ based on the genre of game or the technology used to play it? In order to examine the relationship between immersion and D&D, it is first necessary to define this term and its various connotations. For many people, immersion is the ultimate goal of gaming. Despite its importance, there is no single agreed-upon definition. Some scholars have concrete definitions and view it as a staged process with prerequisites. Others view it as a more ephemeral idea that involves diminishing critical distance and increasing emotional involvement in the imaginary scenario. Despite the varying opinions, all the definitions I have read have certain things in common: changed perception of time, emotional bonds and empathy, and reduced awareness of reality and the apparatus used to play a game. In D&D, there is no controller as such. The player moves by explaining what they want to do. Therefore, I believe that imaginative immersion is the more apt term in this case. If I am able to act in character without too much thought, I have become immersed in that role. Sound allows players to more easily forget that they are playing a game. It has the effect of increasing immersion, not least because we have been trained by other types of media to associate music with plot and emotions. Now that I have discussed music at length, I have compiled a list of some of the most important functions of music in D&D. Emotional. Music can impact on a player's emotional state, thereby increasing empathy with characters and plot and increasing immersion. Referential. Music can use semiotic codes and references in order to compare and contrast the scenario with other media. Communication. In a non-visual medium, music has a much more impact on how we characterize places, people, and situations in our imagination. It can also communicate abstract concepts like danger, safety, and stealth. Genre. Music has different priorities depending on the genre of the campaign. In a gothic horror, the emphasis might be on tension, in high fantasy, on heroism. Continuity. Music can be used as a focal point in order to connect sessions together into a campaign, via a theme or genre of music, for example. Practical issues. Music can help with many practical issues of storytelling, such as pacing, understanding the plot, and levels of concentration. In order to study the impact of sound on D&D immersion, we must first accept the power of the imagination. The boundary between what is physically manifested and what happens within our minds is blurred by games such as D&D, whose action happens in the imagination of its players. Just as cultures form around any hobby, D&D players embrace the lack of authentic truth and the world of shared imaginary ideas. Radigan explains the impact of radio drama in terms of the Buddhist concept of the void. As the listener hears the drama, the void is continually filled with mental visualizations, as real and as vivid as the listener's imagination allows them to be. The willing listener enters into a state of individual virtual reality as they engage with the sounds. In a similar way, although players of D&D imagine things differently, they are all still experiencing a shared virtuality. The three-dimensional aspect of sound allows it to bridge the gap between player and virtuality, creating a significant overlap between worlds. By engaging more with the imagination, players enjoy an incredibly immersive experience that is both social and personal. Just as one does not need visual images to immerse oneself in a book, D&D does not need the strong visuals of digital games to be immersive. In D&D, the voice has two primary functions, dialogue and narration. These modes are often referred to as in character or out of character. Both functions work together as the listener's imagination is heightened by hearing the sound, words, inflections, dynamics, etc. of the storyteller's voice. In order to distinguish between these modes, players often use character voices or accents to convey the difference between these modes. Although there are limits to how much people can change their voice, even small differences can make a character more memorable. This distinction can also help the player to act in character and empathize with their situation more. This in turn increases immersion. Hearing the sounds of other players' characters in a multiplayer game indicates that those players are also present and in and engaged with the same world, thus engaging the imagination. In D&D, the sounds of other players are happening in real time. Dialogue is dynamic and unscripted, and players are asked to embody their character as much as possible. A survey to be distributed via the Google Forms platform, in which I asked both qualitative and quantitative questions. This survey was distributed between the 16th and 29th of February 2020. I was blown away by the final tally of 886 respondents. Due to word spreading on Reddit, it reached 42 countries. Most of my answers came from Anglophonic regions, and they were also mostly male. As you can see, when asked to choose whether a session of D&D with or without music was more immersive experience, the vast majority responded with music. When asked how much they agreed with the statement, "Music has enhanced my overall experience of playing D&D," an overwhelming majority marked greater than 3, indicating their agreement. There is no doubt from this data that music impacts on D&D's immersivity. This is perhaps a good reason why most DMs surveyed stated that they had used music as part of a D&D session. What about player voices? Only 12% of players had never attempted an accent themselves, while around 4% of them had never experienced someone putting on a voice at all during a session. This implies that using a voice is quite common among D&D players. When asked how much they agreed with the statement, "People using character voices or accents have enhanced my overall experience of playing D&D," most players agreed. All of this backs up that music and accents support imaginative games like D&D. There were many elements of my survey which I did not get to talk about, such as gender and voices, genre of music, and much of my qualitative data. I simply did not have the time to examine the latter in detail in order to do it justice. I collected the email addresses of 359 people who were happy to be interviewed further, which I was unable to do within the time frame allowed. It is abundantly clear to me that sound has a profound impact on Dungeons & Dragons. Though the general consensus from ludomusicologists seems to be that dynamic music has a more immersive capabilities than merely interactive music, I believe that the power of the imagination and the reliance on aural rather than visual stimuli allows the former greater power than the latter to capture the player's attention. Music has a clear emotional, theatrical, communicative role in D&D. The functions of music are similar to those of other media. Non-musical sound is vital to creating an immersive environment. The imagination is very good at using these elements to create vivid pictures. Players and character voices add an intimacy on par with ancient storytelling and allow a more interactive experience with the world in which the player embodies their character. The power of these elements combined gives rise to an interactive and unique immersive experience. My survey results confirm that many players feel as I do, that sound has the capability to enliven and improve D&D experiences. It is also clear from the survey responses that the study of sound in relation to Dungeons & Dragons is a promising field of further research. Thank you for listening.